So I love this movie because it asks some really interesting questions, It asks kind of like it makes you think how much of our life comes down to the timing, down to the second of stuff happening. Do we ever truly get over people that have changed us? All right, guys, welcome back. I am so glad you're back for part 2 of our 3-part mini series where we dive in to Richard Linklater's The Before trilogy. So last week we talked about Before Sunrise. Before Sunrise is a beautiful movie that follows Jesse and Celine throughout Vienna for their one night together. We watch their connection blossom. We learn about Richard Linklater's very specific style of writing and directing. So this week, y'all, we get into Before Sunset. This is the second movie, and somehow it manages to feel even more intimate than the first film. If you haven't seen it yet, this is your spoiler warning because we're diving into the whole movie today. All right, y'all. I am not even going to lie. I did not know that Before Sunrise had a sequel. So when we first watched it, my husband kept it a secret from me because he had already seen the trilogy. And he just showed me the first one and just kept it like, oh no, I guess they never saw each other again, right? But then I want to say it was about a week later, he put it on as a surprise. And honestly, I was probably doing homework. I wasn't even paying attention to like what he was putting on the TV, like how he was streaming. So when the movie started and it begins in the bookstore and I see Jesse, I freak out. I tell him like, "Oh my goodness, is this what I think it is? Do we really get answers to what the cliffhanger from the first movie?" Like, I was so shocked because I loved that first movie so much. I loved the cliffhanger and, it kept me wishing, like, that I knew more about these characters, not even just to know if they met up again or reunited, but I just loved their intellectual speech and the characters were so interesting to me. So, I was very, very excited to watch the sequel, Before Sunset. So, I feel most people would agree with me that it ends on a cliffhanger, that first movie. And I think that adds to how Linklater wrote his scripts on like how real life is. He writes in large dialogues, but it doesn't seem abnormal because that's how two people communicate when they're kind of expressing their feelings. All right, so Before Sunset, this was released in 2004. So this is 9 years after Before Sunrise. And the movie is also set in 2004. So it's set in real time. It's taken place 9 years later as well. So the movie begins at a bookstore in Paris. We learn that Jesse is on his last night of his book tour, so he's going to be flying back to the US after the evening ends. He's reading his new novel. Do we have any guesses on what that novel might be about? I'm sure y'all are right. You probably know what it is. Of course, his novel is about the magical night he spent in Vienna with the woman very many years ago that he misses. So, at this point, like I said, it's been 9 years since Vienna. So you kind of see Jesse as an adult. His mannerisms are older. He is still witty in the same way, but you can see the shift in real life has happened to him. So after his reading, he's answering questions from the audience at his book reading, and he turns to his right and he's surprised to see Celine. And at first, their communication is quite awkward, but they fall back into their natural flow very, very quickly, kind of the same way as I don't know about you guys, but I live far away from my best friends, but we don't talk every single day because, we're adults, we work full time. I have a son. So whenever we do chat, it's kind of very sparsely, but it just we fall right back into it. There's no kind of awkwardness. So they fall right back into their communication and their comfortableness very, very quickly. And I kind of like that it's awkward because wouldn't it be? It's been 9 years. You don't know if one of them showed up at Vienna, the other one didn't. Maybe they had met each other. You don't know what their situation is. So I like that. It's very awkward at first. So they leave the bookstore, and Celine says that she knows a great cafe nearby. So they decide to walk to it. During that walk, we learn that Celine is living in Paris. She's an environmental activist. Jesse's living in New York. He's also married and has a young son. So they have grown. They live adult lives now. Celine, during the walk, asks Jesse if he showed up at the train station like they had planned in December. He quickly and defensively responds, "Did you?" Celine explains that she couldn't, and she asks again if he did. And she expresses that it's important to know if he did or he didn't. And again, he's a little defensive and he says, well, he doesn't understand why she wants to know and why it's important to her she didn't go herself. And then he eventually just says, no, he didn't go. Celine sighs with relief and starts laughing. And she's like, oh, thank God you didn't. And she apologizes for laughing because she says, like, I'm not trying to be rude. It's just, I'm just so relieved that you didn't go either because I didn't. And Jesse says what I'm about to say with obviously hurt feelings, but he says, oh, yeah, thank God you didn't go. Thank God I didn't go. Because then that'd be silly. One of us went, the other one didn't. And then Celine explains that she felt horrible after all of these years for not being able to make it. And she tells him that her grandmother died a few days before and she was buried that day that they had planned to meet. And Jesse was like, oh, the one in Budapest. So they had talked about that in the first movie. And she's like, oh, yeah. She seemed very confused that he would remember that detail about her life. He responds to her that, of course, he remembers everything from the day. And she says, oh, right, because you're a big, famous novelist and you wrote a novel about it. And they just laugh. So then I think they walk a little bit more, and Celine actually has time to process that he didn't show up. So she starts to get upset and says, why didn't he show up? That if her grandmother hadn't died, she would have been there. She had made the plans, she had booked a flight, she would have been in Vienna. And at that point, Jesse can't keep the lie going, and he kind of just gives her a look. And it's quiet, and then she realizes, oh, he did show up. And she apologizes, and She hopes that he doesn't hate her, and she says, "Well, now you know why I didn't show up. I had a real reason. I'm so sorry." And he's like, "No, you're fine, it is what it is, and we move on." And they briefly touch on how silly it was that they didn't exchange any contact information, that that kind of left just a missing link between them of, like, always a big regret of that night. So after they finish at the cafe, they take a walk through a garden, and this is where their conversations turn into deeper topics. So they discuss failed relationships, they discuss fears that they have about getting older. They they express their changed views on love. I don't know if you guys remember in the first film they talked about their views on love and relationships. And then they talked about how that night in Vienna has affected Celine, and it affected her because she explains that since that night, she has not been able to open up to people in the same way. I think that that like, sense of missing him has not allowed her to fully open up to someone else in fear that that person would also leave and she would never see them again in the same way. And so then we follow them walk to they get to the river and then they do a boat tour. When they're there, Celine talks about romance on a little bit deeper of a level, and she explains kind of her now cynical point of views on the topic of love and romance, and how her recent partners have kind of viewed her as more of a piece of meat instead of actually a partner. So after their boat ride, we follow them getting into a car to go to her apartment in Paris. And at this point, Jesse finally admits that he wrote this book in hopes to get in touch with her again, in hopes that she would see it and reach out, or even see it and maybe go to one of his book signings, something like that, where it would be a way for them to reconnect. Because he brings up the book, this is the point where she admits that reading that book brought back really painful memories for her. They were painful because she felt like she lost out on a lover. He was her long lost love, and she would never get something like that again. So it was painful for her to kind of relive that through a novel. So now we're gonna get towards the end of the movie. They get to her apartment, and this is kind of the scene where it shifts to them being more intimate in their like longing for each other. They have music playing, and at one point, Celine sings Jessie a song that she wrote about their night in Vienna. And this song really touches Jessie. This is this song is really, really beautiful as well. I think the actress actually sings this in the song in the movie, and it's just such a beautiful, touching song where she kind of explains that some people might think bad on him, but she has always thought the best of him from that night of knowing him. So once the song ends, they both realize that Jesse needs to leave soon if he's going to catch his flight back to the US. He has got to leave to make it back to the airport. And Celine kind of teases him and says, "Oh, as a joke, you're going to miss your flight." And he replies, "I know." and smiles and kind of leaves us on a second cliffhanger. All right, guys. So every time I watch this movie, I'm reminded on kind of how little actually happens, but yet everything happens. It feels like everything happens in this movie. There's not any crazy action scenes or like plot twists. It's just people talking and walking and communicating. And if someone were to just tell me that, of course I'd be like, that sounds boring. But it's so captivating because of the dialogue. The dialogue carries the entire movie. So I think that's what makes this trilogy really, really special. The conversations aren't there to explain the plot. The conversations are the whole entirety of the plot. One thing that I really loved seeing is kind of how both of the characters have changed. Like I've said, it's been 9 years. Jesse has now become a successful author, but in his expressions about romance and love and everything, it's clear that he's not happy in his marriage. He's built this life that looks successful, but it's clear that he's always been waiting for Celine. He's always had that little hope that he would see her again. And, you know, they all, they both kind of express the, well, what would have happened in our life if we had showed up in Vienna, if we had both met there? How different would our life have been? For Celine, we learn that she's an environmental activist and she's incredibly passionate about her work, and that's kind of what drives her. Is she is very work oriented and she's happy doing that. But she expresses regret also, and it's very telling that they both clearly have not moved on from the idea of seeing each other again. All right, guys, so we're going to go back to the script and talk about that for a little bit. So, I really like the way that this script is like real life. No one talks in a perfect movie dialogue in real life. So, in this movie, they interrupt each other, they change subjects, they kind of cut people off, they laugh in awkward moments, and they say things that they immediately take back and regret. It feels so messy, but messy in a truthful and realistic way. And Linklater, like the previous movie, he directs it with the camera rarely cutting away. So kind of like a documentary style, I believe I said in the last podcast. We follow them throughout the city, and it kind of just it's like we're on a walk with them at that moment. So I love this movie because it asks some really interesting questions. It asks kind of like it makes you think how much of our life comes down to the timing, down to the second of stuff happening. Do we ever truly get over people that have changed us? Can one missed opportunity shape everything that comes afterwards? And all of these questions, and it helps us explore the difference of life and how we can imagine it in life that ends up how we're living. I think most adults can probably relate to that in some way. So I think that it's a great kind of shift because even if you saw that the first movie when it first came out, the second one came out 9 years later, so you kind of fall into, "I'm older now, I've lived my life," and you kind of follow these characters in that same way of their growth. So, y'all, this movie is my favorite out of the trilogy because you get to see the intention and the yearning between the characters. You see it a little bit more just because they've lived their life without each other, but this time they know that they exist and they know that they miss being around each other. So I have it rated on my IMDb as, drumroll please, a 10. I love it. I love it. I can watch it whenever. I've probably seen it. I can't even count. I absolutely love this movie. All right, guys. So we are going to get into the third movie before midnight next week. What do y'all think is going to happen? Obviously, we're left on a little bit of a cliffhanger. I can tell you that it will be placed again 9 years later. So at this point, the characters are going to be in their early 40s. So remember, in the second movie, Jesse is married and lives in New York, and Celine lives in Paris. So keep that in mind and kind of think what could have happened. I mean, think of the possibilities of either or. What could have happened in 9 years? I cannot wait to talk about it with you guys next week, y'all. Goodbye, and we'll talk soon, okay? Thank you so much for listening to When the Lights Go Down. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with another movie lover. See y'all next week.